Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the Exceptional Podcast. Today, we have a really interesting one. I would love to welcome, in a moment, Georgia Bradburn, who is a short filmmaker and Queen's Mary University film student, as well as Sam Ahern, who is a visual artist, co-presenter of Are You Autistic on C4, and an Autism Youth Council member. And that is not all. They've also co-created with a whole heap of other individuals a film called The Stimming Pool that myself and my colleague Tim were lucky enough to go view recently. It's a hybrid film made in collaboration with the Neuroculture Collective and Steve Eastwood, and it showcased autistic perceptions and perspectives and something that they call the autistic camera. Anyway, to find out more, let's bring on our guests.
Thank you for inviting us.
I have to say that, but I appreciate it. Right. Do you know what? This is a unique thing that you have all created. Rather than me go into any more detail, I would love to hear from your own perspectives. So my first question, let's hit the ground running. Could you both introduce yourselves and tell us a bit about your role on the Stimming Pool and maybe a bit about why you were interested in getting involved with it? Should we start off with Sam?
Cool. Hi, gang. I'm Sam Ahern. I'm a visual artist. As Nat has said, I was originally brought on to the Stimming Pool as an advisor, as somebody who was an advisor to the project, because a big part of the project was thinking about co-collaboration, and that was my original role. And then I thought to myself, I'm going to absolutely not be a very happy human if I don't join in with all this fantastic filmmaking and arts making. And so I then jumped on board as a director and writer and filmmaker, as it were. And I suppose what drew me to it was the interest of film and autism. And at the time it was doing a lot, for me, it was thinking about quite a lot of the work that I had been doing up until that point was in very similar. And so I thought, actually, this is a perfect opportunity for me to get involved in. So yeah, that's how I came on board.
I'm Georgia Bradburn, or Georgia Kumari Bradburn, whatever you prefer. I am a filmmaker. I joined the project when I was studying at Queen Mary University, and at the time I was in my second year, I think. But I'd been a filmmaker before that, and so I had that experience behind me, and I was really interested in being in a collective of autistic filmmakers because I'd always felt quite stifled by neurotypical structures of filmmaking and neurotypical ideas in filmmaking, so it was really a breath of fresh air to be able to work in this context. And yeah, I worked as a director. I was mainly working with the camera, and I developed the concept of the autistic camera, partially developed the concept of the autistic camera and the shapeshifter character. They were my areas that I focused on. And I'm also a programmer. I work on relaxed screenings with Sam as well at the BFI. And yeah, that's me.
Thank you both for that. Really, really impressive. Now, I would ask you, maybe I will ask you to describe the film in a moment, but it is quite avant-garde and experimental. I think maybe an easier way is if I can show the trailer to everyone, just so they can get a feel of what it's like.
The film you're about to see is of a content so horrifying, so gruesome. Remember, you have been warned.
Is it okay if I put on a new clip?
I'd move my foot on the ground or I'd rock in my chair.
Stimming, dancing, gyrating, it's all permitted.
With the bang, with the boom, with the bang, 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 bang.
Nice. Honestly, so eerie. I love it.
The horror aspect is probably from Robin, who is a very experienced and has an incredible knowledge of B movies. And so that was the horror aspect probably was influenced by him a lot. But we all had our own, I suppose, influences that we looked at. We looked at Uncle Boomy and Playtime by Jacques Tati and various other films that I think spoke to being unusual and being odd and being different. Yeah, and I think quite a lot of those, you can probably tell where quite a lot of the influences.
I can say that one of the co-directors, Ben's influences was Terry Gilliam. So I guess there's maybe a little bit of a crossover there in terms of like aesthetic and theme, especially the surreal testing sequences. There's definitely a lot of Brazil in there.
Brings on to the first full question, is understanding how this idea emerged. Like, for instance, did it always start off quite surreal, or was that something that you decided as a collective? How did it all come about? And yeah, if you could expand upon that a little.
We all came to the project with various different ideas. Robin and Lucy, who were 2-member collectives, they came to this project with very specific ideas about what they wanted to do. And Ben as well, to an extent. He was very wanting to do a sort of sequence around testing and explore testing. Robin wanted to create his own fictional B-movie that you see in the film. Lucy wanted to create a character and then throughout the story explore that. Myself and Georgia came up with various other aspects of the film. So Georgia came up with the shapeshifter character, and me and Georgia and Ben as well took on the roles of seeing the overall vision of the film, as it were. So essentially thinking about how can Robin and Lucy's ideas work within these themes that we're exploring. And there's a lot of themes and ideas that we explore within the film. And they include things like masking and testing and shapeshifting, but also we look at horror, we look at embodying autisticness in that respect. It's not necessarily a film about autism, even though it's been created by autistic people. And it's not a film where the audience get taught about autism. It's more a sensory film in that aspect. So we do a lot of exploration of quiet moments in the film, as well as moments in the film that are very overwhelming and quite intense for the audience to watch. I suppose in terms of the idea, it was multiple ideas, and then I like to consider it as a bit of a patchwork quilt where it was quite literally knitting everybody's ideas in a functional way that also worked but also didn't alienate the audience whilst they were watching it as well.
That's a very interesting approach, and I think it had all the potential to be a disaster, but you pulled it off. It feels both connected and disconnected at the same time. When you have those TV episodes where you do a day in the life of multiple characters and at certain points they all kind of like cross paths and intertwine. You mentioned a lot of names there. I'm assuming for the audience, they're all people who were part of the collective, right? Was that created just for this project, or is it something that you do as outside of Stimming Pool?
Just for this particular project. So we should maybe talk about who the collective members are for context of the audience. They're myself and Georgia. They're Benjamin Brown, Lucy Walker, and Robert Elliot Knowles. Robin and Lucy both are Hastings-based, and myself, Georgia, and Ben are all London-based. And we did quite a lot of partnership with Project Artwork and working with Project Artworks, as well as working with Queen Mary and other people as well. But yes, in answer to your question, in terms of thinking about it as a sort of day in a life approach where multiple characters intertwine and interweave, it's very much that, where we get characters who we never thought would meet actually all come together at the end, which is really lovely.
Brilliant, thank you. And for Georgia, for this question is for you. I'm curious to know more about the autistic camera. Like, what does it mean to you, and how does it influence the film's perspectives?
I came on board being more interested. I'm less interested in autistic representation through character on screen. And I think the film really embodies that, because there's never any part where it's this character's autistic and this character's autistic. And for me, it was more about how can the film itself embody sort of an autistic sensibility. And so I think before we shot the film, I'd just done my thesis for uni, and that was about how you can transfer autistic expression or autistic feeling. So the sort of adrenaline you feel before you're stimming or before you have a meltdown, and there's really things that you can't communicate. How do you put those into film? And in part of developing the stimming pool, I thought it was important that the camera itself would become a character and be embodied. A camera that could stim, a camera that could mask. And so we created a manifesto for the camera and this character with like diagnostics, but also pointing out that diagnosing the camera kind of goes against the point, because it's not defined by a rigid criteria. It's more fluid than that. But yeah, there were different states of the camera's masking. So it's like documentary, static shots, tracking. Basically just you forget the camera's there because you're focusing on what's being filmed. And then there would be moments where the camera is fascinated by a detail on screen that's not necessarily the focus. It's not the character that's speaking. And then there are moments where the camera stims, so it learns from the characters it's filming or on itself to move in circular or repetitive motions. And there's a scene with a character we call the shapeshifter, who usually wears a blue coat in the film. And the camera sort of follows them stimming throughout their house and gradually moves out of its masked state of just observing and itself begins to stim. And that's one of the first instances really we see of that camera relearning its own stims, which is something quite personal for me because I stopped stimming as a child and as a teenager because it was taught out of me. And over the last couple of years, I've learned from other autistic people around me and the social model of disability movement that stimming is something I can reintroduce into my life. So reintroducing stimming into camera work was really important. And I think it gives the film more of a sensory perspective. And it really shows that it's from an autistic point of view and an autistic artistic framework. And it's not just about how do we represent an autistic character ethically and responsibly. The way to do that is within the fabric of the film itself. And we worked with an amazing DP, Greg Oak, who is most well known for shooting the film After Sun. And he really understood exactly what it was that we were going for. And it became quite intuitive and choreographed in the way that he would adapt the manifesto and the characteristics of the camera. And I couldn't be more happy with how it is. And people have really responded to the way the camera reflects some experiences of autism in a way that I don't feel like a lot of people have seen before. And so, yeah, I'm hoping it can offer something new and offer a new framework for autistic filmmakers who want to employ their autisticness into the way that they film.
It definitely has a very strong mise-en-scene about it, like its own kind of character to it. It almost felt like the camera was dancing throughout, which I quite enjoyed. And to your point around that you don't actually mention autism, it's not a film about autism, yet it is. And I'm a big fan of that because we do a lot of education here at Exceptional Individuals, and I'm a big advocate of not being too hung up on a diagnostic label. So what? Autism existed before it had a label. It existed before we keep changing the diagnostic criteria. If you were removing all the labels, autism would still exist. And in this film's reality, it doesn't have to be named to know that there is a difference. But at no point is it seen as positive or negative. It just is what it is. Or at least that's what I took away from it personally.
Yeah, exactly. I think the whole idea of it being a stimming pool, it's a space that's created for autistic people to be in because a lot of community spaces aren't really accessible. So it's offering that space and it's not really putting forth a judgment on that label because it's just saying there are people that exist in different ways and there are people that cannot exist in these spaces because they are built for neurotypicals. What we're going to do is create a new space, or we're going to rewild, I guess, these spaces. And there's sequences in the film where the characters are night walking and go into empty spaces, the empty supermarket, the empty spin class, and reappropriate the space in a way that they can stim. It is positive in the sense that it's offering like a sense of liberation, a sense of autonomy for autistic characters, but at no point does it lean into the whole autism is a superpower and autistic people are like better than everyone else. It doesn't lean into that, because it's a bit exhausting at this point to be told that. Yeah, I think we wanted to keep it neutral as possible.
I really appreciate that. It's an area which yes, it has strengths. Yes, it has weaknesses. It's not all it's not all sunshine and rainbows, but it's not doom and gloom. And this goes back to the point that you mentioned previously, Sam, about the kind of day in the life, the kind of layered worlds. Now, the stories, they do intertwine, and it's a little bit Inception-y, like kind of layers and layers. I'm curious to know, was that due to incorporating multiple people's ideas, or is there more to it? As a viewer, I saw it as focusing on the fact that autistic people tend to be comfortable in their own self and not necessarily need to collaborate. However, our lives naturally interweave, particularly in the stimming pool. People were doing their own thing and they weren't necessarily interacting.
Yeah, I think in terms of do they all come together, that was definitely a merging of ideas and a merging of characters, but also coming to understand that these characters and beings have all come from various different spaces and locations, and they all essentially either, whether they recognize it or not, end up at the stimming pool, either at the end or they walk past each other in the street. And I suppose that's quite beautiful in that respect, that they don't have to have an interaction, or they can acknowledge that the others are there, because there's definitely that, I suppose, that acknowledgement specifically between the shapeshifter and, I suppose you could call this person my character as well. There's a sort of semi-meeting at the stimming pool, but also then again on the night walking where we walk past one another. Yeah. But again, I suppose the beauty of that is that you don't get the start of that interaction, if that makes sense. They just are both within the same space, and they don't necessarily need to have a conversation, or they don't need to broach the idea to one another that we're sharing the same space. Actually, they can be their own selves within that space in whichever way they feel comfortable. And actually, I think that's quite a beautiful existence in some ways, where you can acknowledge that, but then also you don't actually have to have that interaction, because then that means a whole host of other things that somebody might find difficult.
I agree with you on that. It's almost just because you may be autistic or different from the norms, that of course you must be friends with someone else who is autistic or different from the norms.
Yeah.
And this is saying, you know what, we live in the same reality, but there isn't anything that necessarily connects us, nor should there have to be.
Yeah. And it's also real of true life as well, right? Just thinking, not every autistic person or neurodivergent person you meet, you're going to have the same connections with. You might have a similar experience, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to become one, as it were. And actually, that's the beauty of the spectrum in a way, is that you learn that, and you learn how to interact with all of that in that way. And I think for this purpose of the film, funnily enough, in terms of the dialogue, there is not much dialogue between the characters, if any. There's no dialogue between any of our characters apart from interacting with people you don't necessarily see. For example, with my character, you see them interacting with the tester. With the shapeshifter, you see them interacting with a couple of work colleagues, and that's about it. And with Chess, created by the wonderful Lucy, you see her interacting with Tom as Chess, but then that's just because Tom and Lucy have a very good working relationship, and there is a real respect and understanding there, that it was obvious that they had to be filmed together as they would be within their daily lives, as it were, because that's how they work together. I suppose in that respect, that's it. That Robin's character interacting with his dad and a few people at the cinema, but you don't see Robin interacting with myself or with the shapeshifter. So in that respect, the space is shared, but there's no real conversations happening. And I suppose that's quite fascinating. Actually, I've actually never thought about it like that.
I like with you mentioned about how people had good chemistry, so they were paired together. How autobiographical is each of your characters? Were you acting or were you yourself?
I could be either or. Do you know what I mean? I was Sam watching the screen. That was it. It's not. We could call that acting. Some people could call that non-acting. I'm with Dre, our fantastic shapeshifter. He was performing in that respect. He was the shapeshifter when he was on camera. Lucy, who dressed up as Chess, was Lucy portraying Chess. And there's a beautiful moment where Tom, Lucy's support worker, very quickly shifts between Lucy taking Chess's head off and going, "Oh, Lucy, hi, I've just met Chess." And that's a really nice moment between these two people. Georgia, please.
If I can just hop in, I think there's a really interesting thing to be said about, we talked a lot about negotiating the boundary between masking and unmasking. So from feeling like you're performing to people and you're putting on like a neurotypical front and transitioning to being unmasked and being able to stim and be weird and all of that. And there's some characters, for example, like Robin performs, and he performs his impersonations of people, but that's not him masking. That is him being himself. Whereas with the shapeshifter character Dre, then performing neurotypicality in the office and all of these different spaces is masking. And so there's a really interesting thing about how we perform. Is performance inherent to being autistic or masking? And especially with the shapeshifter character, we wanted to show the difference between their external self and their internal self, and going inside their house and being able to unmask. But also a way a lot of us stim is by performing and by impersonating and by doing echolalic vocal stims. So I think, there's a really interesting thing there as well. But like Sam said, I think it's some autobiographical, some like things to fit sort of the narrative and fit all the little pieces that we were trying to sew together.
I really enjoy that perspective, because the truth is, when people ask me like that, are you masking? I don't know. Like sometimes I'm not aware. Like sometimes when I'm acting, which is technically a mask, I feel most comfortable. And honestly, if you knew what my questions were coming up, it was about masking and authenticity. Because half the film seems to be about masking and the other half seems to be about stimming, which is being more authentic to yourself. I want to expand a bit more upon that, about how the contrast between the two. So is it portrayed as positive, negative, neutral? Does the film have an opinion on masking versus stimming?
We had a lot of conversations about this, actually, just in terms of thinking about certain environments which the characters would go into, and certain environments that we as autistic people find really tricky to go into. For example, like the office, there's certain rules that you have to follow. With the pub, there's certain rules that you have to follow. I suppose even in some respects, the rules of the home in that aspect. So it's very much public versus private, but also thinking around how do our characters respond to these environments as well. So with the shapeshifter, we had a very good conversation with Dre beforehand about how he finds being in an office when he's in an office space, and how does he feel when he's in a very crowded, overwhelmed work environment that is slightly rigid in terms of its rule-based, but then also how does that then influence the shapeshifter and how they find it in that aspect. And then thinking about other environments. So when the shapeshifter comes home, there is that literal change of presence of going, "Oh, I'm home," and become present, whatever that may be. And so there was a lot of conversation that we had around masking in public versus masking in private, and stimming in public and stimming in private, and even in the office where the shapeshifters get becoming overwhelmed, there's then a sense of they start stimming with certain objects, but then also certain movements that are quite contained that nobody would recognize as stimming, that is socially acceptable to do. But then the more stim-like movements that they do when they're at home is very different as well. So I suppose I suppose in some respects, in answering to your question, it was a neutral position in terms of thinking about masking and stimming. But then also there was a lot of conversations from our end around how do we also find these environments when we enter them as autistic people, because there's certain elements of society that it's socially acceptable to be a part of. For example, the French exit, which is where you leave without having an explanation. And I would, if I'm struggling with the space, it's thinking, okay, how can I leave without having to say goodbye, but then also saying goodbye, because I've been taught that's a very polite thing to do. So it's thinking about those small nuances around social interaction, around being perceived as one person and then presenting yourself as another. So again, publicly, private.
You know how we talked about obviously the layers and everyone's lives are happening individually?
Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, at least, everyone was going about their life, and you could see that just day-to-day stuff like hosting a cinema event or just being around, it is a form of masking, and that not necessarily a bad thing. For instance, the character who was doing the B movie, I think he was very much enjoying himself, but that doesn't take away from the social and emotional strain that has throughout your day. And ultimately, when everyone ended up at the stimming pool, that was, for me, a metaphor of that's when you say get at home and you're like, I can just be myself now.
I think the neutrality was of like not passing judgment on being like, oh, masking is bad and we shouldn't have to do it anymore. I think neutrality was important because, yes, in a utopian society, because I feel like the stimming pool at the end is very much a utopian idea of what things would be like. In a utopia, we wouldn't have to mask, but masking is integral to survival. And I always do get not annoyed but weird when people are like, oh, you don't have to mask around me, or like you don't have to mask anymore. It's like, it's not something that you can just be like, oh, okay, phew, I don't have to mask. Like, it is a survival mechanism that we have learned since childhood, that we have learned to have or to be guarded at all times. And it's not something that you can just be like, I don't have to do this anymore and I'm just being myself. It's so inherent. And yes, it is tiring and taxing and exhausting, and ideally we wouldn't have to do it, but it is an important part of the autistic experience. I would never have wanted the film to judge the idea of masking or shame the idea of masking, because it is important and it's part of the experience as it is now.
I think masking is a very natural part of being human. Since our hunter-gatherer days, where if a tiger came, you want to stand up really big and make yourself feel dominating. If a cat gets angry at you, and I think all these kind of ways that you kind of change who you are normally in order to fit a situation for survival, perfectly natural. But when it comes to autistic individuals, I believe that it's essentially being like called but consistently. And because of how long you're doing it for, that's where the difficulty comes from, not inherently doing it. So we always feel in a place of danger almost. And that's why we've always got to be on guard.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think the more of this type of work I do, the more people are aware that I myself am an autistic person, but then also there's an explanation there of, do I disclose? There's also then that element of disclosure. Where does disclosure come in, and in what circumstances is it okay to disclose? Are people knowledgeable enough of autism? Are they able to understand how that affects me? Because I think it's quite interesting in terms of that is a sort of separate conversation in a way that none of these characters do inherently identify as autistic, but then, as we've spoken about, there are definitely isms of autism that sort of pollinate the film in that respect. But then it's also, they have to, because they're all being portrayed by autistic people. Whether we wanted these characters to be autistic or not, inherently they are being portrayed by autistic people. And that in itself is fascinating, quite fascinating in a way. That in terms of casting the shapeshifter, like that was a definite, yes, we definitely wanted somebody who was neurodivergent and somebody who could bring their own, whether that was going to be aware, sort of something that we would speak about or not, but bringing their own lived experience of being a neurodivergent person and how, if any, that would interact or influence the shapeshifter.
Is the shapeshifter meant to be a human, or is it not defined?
I guess there's something in it being not defined, but I called it the character the shapeshifter because of the shape-shifting nature of the being autistic. And I think also there is that supernatural element where they see themselves in the B movie and they end up in Robin's movie, and I think that's more about the film itself being a shapeshifter in genre. You could say that they are like a supernatural character, but for me it was more about how you shapeshift your behavior, your accent. There's that bit where they're talking in the different accents when they're walking down the street, which is something that I do. I wanted to incorporate that element, that versatility into the character, and that's why they're called that.
See, from how maybe I interpret it wrong, but the thing with films really isn't a right or wrong. It's that the person you call shapeshifter is a person, but a name would actually be counterproductive because they are to represent many people. We are all masking in a way, and that mask doesn't have a name. It could be anything. And this does again nicely set up what I wanted to talk about next is when we've all talked about our own personal experiences, which are really important. But when we are discussing autism, we are discussing a massive spectrum. How did you try to incorporate as many different perspectives as possible without it becoming too bloated? And as such, this was co-created by autism, not necessarily for autism, but it was a very native part of the process.
I think the fact that the film is co-created by several directors was the first important thing we did to ensure that the film wasn't constrained by a single generalized perspective. Because having, I feel like we all have quite different experiences of autism. And so that's also why the film is so jumbled in its genres and its styles, because it is a spectrum. And the term spectrum is a bit overused at the moment because a lot of people use it to be like, we're all on the spectrum somewhere.
Yeah, it does have
really
a
annoying.
bad taste.
But I like talking about the spectrum of representation because obviously autism, as you say, isn't one size fits all. And so having a film that was co-created by autistic people is important. And of course we weren't aiming to make a film that was like, this is what autism is. And it's all the information is in there. I think we regarded it more as like a stepping stone, like a proposal of what would a film made by autistic people and formed by purely autistic perspectives look like. And the film was never intended to be a guide or a proposal for, I don't know, this is the Bible of autism in a way. It is a film that is made by autistic people. And sure, there is responsibility in there to represent things accurately, but because we're all autistic, we are just making things from our experience, and that's important. I think I would hope that the film would provide people, autistic filmmakers, with it would let people be able to think that they can make films that are informed by their perspective, not just about a character that's autistic, but a film that is autistic in the way that it's structured. And yeah, it was more of a stepping stone in that sense than a model, because who are we to say this is what autism is? We're just artists talking about our experience and being silly, and that's what it's all about, really.
I think people do tend to go to the extreme. They'll see it like, all right, that's how it's done now. I think this is a great example of how it can be done, but obviously we want the kind of flexibility. Now, as all three of us at some stage has worked in TV or media. I would imagine you've had serious experiences similar to myself where it's not the most inclusive industry by any means. And while you said it's not meant to be a guidebook, and I fully appreciate that, are there any sort of industry changes that you think that industry can learn from the Stimming Pool and how you created this project?
Yes, is the short answer to that question. One of the things that we tried to do with the filming aspect of it was make this process as accessible as it could be for everybody involved. And something that we did, and something that I think we should also recognize, was that we all had very different experiences of filmmaking. So for some of us, this was our first time on a set, right? And we had, I'll be honest, not much idea of what happens on set. And so for others, they were a bit more experienced in terms of, oh, okay, so we have to move this rigger from here to here. Fantastic, right? So in terms of that, it was really paring back. What does a cinematographer do? What does the sound recorder do? What does the lighting person do? What is your role within this film, etc.? What are you thinking about? What we as individuals, as well as artists, were interested in, and then going, okay, if you want to work with these people, then this is you can do, which is really good. So that was a fantastic thing. But then actually during filming, we had on-set advisors, at least 2 or 3 on-set advisors who were present every single day. We had, when it came to call sheets and call times, everybody with the call sheet got photographs of what everybody looked like, what everybody's role was, and what they wanted to be called, emails, pronouns, contact details, etc., which is really good. We had photographs of where we were filming and the journey that we were going to have to take to get from where we were staying to the location. And that's just one aspect, one tiny little aspect that we use, that even our on-set photographer, who was also neurodivergent, and a good 90% of our crew were neurodivergent, which was really nice and really good in terms of making sure that as a genuinely, this could be as inclusive as it could be as a process. But even our on-set photographer, on her first day, she was just saying to us, this is amazing because I've never seen pictures of people who I'm going to work with, because I just get a call sheet with names and people's job roles. And that's great, but she then said, I don't know who I'm meeting when I arrive on set. So I think in terms of that aspect, that was really good, because by the end of filming, everybody felt like they'd actually achieved something. And it wasn't a real, okay, we've got to get this done, we've got to go really quickly, we've got to do this, X, Y, Z. When you go, bish, bosh, bosh, job's done. So that was really good in that aspect. Working with Dre was fantastic because they had a sort of really good sort of set amount of times that they could film for. So they were really clear in terms of, this is how long I can film for. I can only do 3 or 4 takes and then that's it. So in terms of that was really good. And that was really good in terms of getting us to focus about the performance that we wanted him to bring to the role. But then it was other things as well, like what happens after the film, what happens after we filmed it, and when we go to edit, what does an edit look like? What does a test screening look like? So it's thinking about all those steps that if somebody's an autistic filmmaker or just a new filmmaker and doesn't know the steps that this takes, this was a really good approach in terms of paring it back and going, this is what you need to do to get a crew together. This is how we film it. This is the editing. This is the aftermath of that. And so in that aspect, that was really good, because you could have as much approach to this as much as you wanted to, or you could just be there for the filming days and that was it. So I think it really varied depending on people. I realised I haven't actually spoken about representation. I've just spoken about
I think
all the access.
it speaks for itself, to be honest. And
yeah.
do I think to me, it looked like a really fascinating thought experiment, similar to when you go to certain companies that say only have autistic staff and they build up the processes from the ground up. That being said, you tell me if you think differently. I don't think we should be creating autism only groups or autism only companies. I think ultimately we want pure integration, but we need to essentially create some sort of rule book, even if the rule book is we recreate it every single time.
Yeah, it's interesting when I've done like autism training for jobs. It's a really fascinating moment where some people go, oh, we've realized that this not only helps our autistic employees, but it helps us too. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is fantastic, because we're no longer having to scurry around and actually say, yeah, the lighting in this office is actually quite bright. Do you think we could turn it down? That's just like a tiny little example of it, where I think the more awareness and the more understanding that comes out of these types of conversations hopefully then impacts.
They're not autistic adjustments. It's not an autistic company. It's just a company that is more inclusive. I know, as simple as that.
Yeah. I think the point a lot of disability activists are always making is that once you make something, like Sam said, once you make something accessible for some people, you make it accessible for everyone. Because not only does it make things easier for those people, but it gives other people the space to be able to be like, actually, this is what I need. Because everyone has access needs. If people don't consider themselves to be disabled, there are things that can make things more comfortable. Especially in the film industry, because the film industry is very punishing, because everything is about saving money and doing everything really quickly. And everything is like a military drill. And it's not just autistic and disabled people who struggle with that, it's everyone. A lot of people are alienated from the industry because of how fast-paced things are. I have chronic fatigue syndrome as well, so that limits what I'm able to do in film, because I can't be working really long days and I can't be on my feet for too long. When we were working on the Stimming Pool, it was important to outline that the accessibility comes first, and the comfort of the crew is the most important thing here, and it should be that on everything. I'm hoping that other producers and production companies and ADs and people like that can take note and make their sets more inclusive for everyone, and not just about how do we make this as quickly as possible and for as little money as possible. There are ways, and we've shown that there is a way to do this. Hopefully this is the start of more inclusive filmmaking in that sense.
I hope so too. Sounds like it could be really pioneering. An example that comes to mind is that before they had child labor laws in place, children were really abused on set. I'm thinking like Judy Garner from Wizard of Oz, who had a horrific experience. Nowadays, children can only work so many hours. Maybe they could expand that for people in general, regardless if you're autistic, a child, elderly, disabled. That's a key takeaway I would like to see people taking from this. This has been a fantastic chat, but obviously we have to end at some point. So I would love if I could get maybe a key message from each of you about what you would hope viewers take away from this.
Make what you want. make what you feel you have to make. Because I feel like I'd felt as an autistic person working in film or doing film, I had to make certain things in a certain way because that's how you're supposed to do them. And this is the sort of neurotypical reality that we make things for. And working on this film has helped me realize that I can actually use my experience and the differences in my experience to make something, and that can be good. Yeah, I would say use what you know, because your experience is the thing that you know the most, and make whatever you want. And yeah, film isn't punishment, is what I'd say.
Thanks so much for that, Georgia. And Sam, any closing words or message you would like people to take away?
Yeah, I enjoyed the process because I think looking back now, this was a really good process. I think in hindsight, I'm very glad I said yes to this. But I suppose if viewers want to watch the film, enjoy the madness and come in with little expectation of what you're about to watch, because hopefully after you'll go, what was that? Which is a good thing in some ways. Yeah, I think enjoy the process and actually, go and enjoy watching there's that awful saying which is make the thing that you want to see on screen. And I suppose I should reference that and say, yeah, make the thing that you want to see on screen. But then also taking that into account of cost and time and energy. So yeah, recognizing that, make what you want to make within the parameters that you yourself can. And then afterwards, rest. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got essentially have the authenticity and enjoy what you're doing. And
Yeah.
ultimately, you make something you enjoy. If people like it, cool. But if they don't, that's equally fine. And I find that approach, while it is quite Marmite, to be honest, when I went into it, I had no idea what to expect. And afterwards, I'll be honest with you, at first, I didn't know what I had just watched. But what I did find is that it created a really good discussion between me and my colleague. And it truthfully has grown on me over the weeks since I've seen it. I thought about it more. And that is something which I cannot say about these massive Hollywood budget films. Once I've watched it, I'm done.
Yeah.
I think you've done a phenomenal job. I think it is not only a great thought experiment, but really well executed. And I think the whole team should be really proud of themselves. And I would just like to thank you both for joining. I really enjoyed listening to you both. And I really encourage other people to go watch The Stimming Pool.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting us. And to those of you who watch it, enjoy.
Cool.
And thank you for watching.
Thank you
Cheers,
so
all.
much for having us. It's been a great chat.